The Tale of the Faithful Dove by Beatrix Potter. There is a town, a little old red-roofed town, a city of gates and walls. It has steep, cobbled streets that go up like the ribs of a crown, and a grey flint church on the summit. The gold weathercock glitters in the sunshine, and the pigeons wheel around it in quick, short flights. As they turn and tumble, their wings gleam white against the thunderclouds over the sea. On harvest days they fly out to the cornfields, but always with an eye on safety, and their nests high up in the Ypres tower, and the other eye for the falcons across the marsh at Camber. But more often they are pecking about in the grass-grown streets, amongst the cobblestones of the marketplace, or in the dusty yard of the windmill by the river. Why should a pigeon risk his tail in Winchelsea marsh, while there is corn in rye? Said Mr. Tiddler, bobbing and bowing and strutting around. My ancestors were Antwerps. We carried messages for the smugglers. My great-great-grandfather used to cross the channel twice a fortnight in a fishing boat, Mr. Tiddler, replied Annabella, preening her wings. My love, your great-great-grandmother was a tumbler, said Mr. Tiddler. But although Mr. Tiddler had differences with his wife, Annabella, they were a most devoted pair. After the habit of pigeons who marry for life, they made their nest of rubbishy twigs and straws in a hole on the Ypres tower, where the wallflowers grow. Annabella had laid an egg in the nest. She had left it and was sunning herself on a broad, flat stone at the edge of the battlements. Mr. Tiddler was hurrying up and down and round, cooing excitedly, turning in his bright pink toes and bobbing and bowing regardless of the complete inattention of his wife. A score of other doves slanted across the face of the cliff below. Annabella slid off the stone and followed them, with a sudden clapping of wings in the hot, silent air. It was Sunday, but indeed even on weekdays the little old town seems always asleep. The sea has slipped away across the marsh and left it stranded, and it dozes through the lazy summer days like the castle of Sleeping Beauty. But the doves are not asleep upon the housetop. They are down in the miller's yard, outside Westgate on the Winchelsea road. There are a dozen red and part-coloured tumblers, black and white nuns, ruffled Jacobins, and dusky blue rocks, trampling about and bobbing their heads as they gobble up the grain. Mrs. Tiddler is in the thick of it, very hungry and pick-peck-pecketing. Mr. Tiddler is on the outskirts, anxious and indignant, but still bobbing and bowing. When a person has laid an egg, a person should not leave the fortifications, said Mr. Thomas Tiddler. He himself spent much of his time doing fancy steps on the long black muzzle of a rusty French gun. My great-granduncle carried little screws of paper twisted around his leg between rye and sandwich, said Annabella. Why should we stay within walls in times of peace? Asked the little white dove. Mr. Tiddler had just tripped over a straw, and before he had time to gather himself together to reply in argument, something came around the sails of the windmill like a thunderbolt. Down went the little white dove, and then up and away in the claws of a peregrine falcon. The falcon's mate was following close behind. He only missed his mark because he hesitated whether to strike Mr. or Mrs. Tiddler. He swept between them undecided, and wheeled up in circles over the mill, ready for a fresh stoop at the pigeons as they raced back into the town. The short-winged doves threaded their way amongst the sheds with sudden twists and turns, flying low and dodging into the streets, where they hoped that the peregrine would not follow them. One of them in its terror dashed in at an open window. The cock pigeon with pathetic senseless courage flew behind his wife to keep between her and the danger. But alas, the tiercel was a judge of pigeon pie, and he had taken a fancy for the plumpness of Annabella. He singled out his intended victim and ignored the other pigeons. Twice he missed his stroke as she dodged frantically amongst the chimney stacks. Most unaccountably missed the second time, when Annabella's fate seemed sealed. But Mrs. Tiddler reverted to the habit of her ancestral relations. She gave an unmistakable tumble and mysteriously disappeared. The peregrine, overshooting his mark, found himself above the church, where he was disconcerted by the sweet strains of the organ. He soared upwards, high over the town, and away across the marsh. Mr. Tiddler, panting and scared almost to death, tumbled into a holly bush in the churchyard. The congregation was just coming out. "There do have been a hawk after them pigeons," remarked the sexton. Pigeons are not very intelligent, but they are unusually faithful. He flew back to the Ypres tower in faint hope that she might have slipped home by Watchbell Lane, but the nest was deserted and the egg was cold. Mr. Tiddler could not bear to look at it. He did not go near it again. He wandered about the red-tiled roofs, moping and disconsolate. At night he roosted on the ridge of the church, all out in the rain. A white owl came and looked at him, and seemed about to make a remark, but it changed its mind and went away. Next day Mr. Tiddler ate nothing and moped. His draggled appearance attracted the attention of a black tomcat. It climbed on the roof of a shed in the street called the Mint, with the intention of catching him. Mr. Tiddler flopped languidly across the road onto another roof, and mourned for Annabella. Annabella's history was simple. In twisting and ducking amongst the chimney stacks to escape from Peregrine, she had, half by accident, half on purpose, dived down the mouth of a tall red chimney pot. The chimney belonged to the garret of an empty house, and the fireplace was stuffed up with a sack. Mrs. Tiddler, breathless and terrified, fell down upon the sack and lay there comfortably enough. There was sufficient room for her to stand up and flap her wings when she recovered. But it was impossible for her to fly upwards and out at the chimney pot 3 yards above her head, a little circle of blue sky and scudding clouds over a shaft of darkness. It is one thing to dive down a narrow hole with the wings closed, and quite another matter to mount, as a pigeon does, with beating wings and in circles. Annabella was trapped. She had a good deal of corn in her crop, which sustained her during the first night, and next morning she laid another egg. She made a satisfactory warm nest for it in the sack, and commenced to sit. "I shall have to sit here for 17 days, said Annabella with contented resignation. But towards night she began to get hungry, and by the time that the stars came out and peeped down the chimney, Annabella was decidedly faint. Once she woke up suddenly and saw a queer round face looking down upon her as she sat on her nest. Annabella thought that it was the moon, but it was a white owl. And there were strange noises in the garret of the empty house. Noises of a very, very little squeaky fiddle, and noises of pattering and dancing, and the buzzing of blue-bottle flies in the middle of the night. Annabella, between dreaming and fainting, cooed drowsily to the music. Early in the morning, while she dozed upon her nest, there came a scrambling amongst the bricks of the chimney-place. "Who is that cooing to my dancers? Who has been making music in my chimney?" asked a little old mouse. "For the love of wheat and barley, send a message to Mr. Tiddler." "I cannot leave my egg. I cannot get out to feed. I am starving, Madam Mouse," said Annabella. The mouse, who was very small and old and dressed in antique fashion, in a silk gown with lace ruffles, examined Mrs. Tiddler through a pair of tortoise-shell glasses. "Indeed, madam, I commiserate with you. I have no experience in laying eggs, but I comprehend the pangs of hunger. The Ypres Tower? I will dispatch a messenger at cock-crow. I fear that I have no refreshment to offer you, madame," added the friendly mouse. "This is an empty house, and we are church mice. We removed to our present abode on account of the owls. I am a mouse of genteel descent," said she, smoothing her faded silk petticoat. Annabella thanked her warmly. She was revived by friendship, and described the exploits of her own ancestors, the Antwerp carriers. "You do not say so, madame. The lace of these ruffles was smuggled. My great-great-grandmother found it in the secret recess of an old bureau." "You interest me extremely, madame. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was a cellar-mouse in the house of a Huguenot grocer." "You may command my services. I will dispatch a dozen starlings. They shall scour the roofs of Rye for Mr. Tiddler." So it happened that in the grey dawn of the second morning, Mr. Tiddler, moping and dozing upon the roof of Rye Town Hall, was aroused by a cock-starling. It pecked him and directed him, half awake, to the top of a tall red chimney-pot in Mermaid Street. "Bless my tail and toes! Annabella, my love! Annabella!" exclaimed Mr. Tiddler, strutting around the top of the chimney-pot and craning over the abyss at imminent risk of falling in, head foremost. "Leave off that ridiculous noise, and fetch me corn at once. I have laid an egg," said Mrs. Tiddler in smothered tones below. So, for more than 2 weeks, day by day, industriously, Mr. Tiddler picked up corn for two? Enough for half a dozen. It would have filled a sack. He collected such quantities in his ardour, and with such boldness, that folks talked about him in the market. They threw him handfuls of grain, and wondered to see him fly away with it, and return presently with an empty crop, for more and more. In and out between the horses' feet, under carts and barrows, or perching fearlessly on an open sack to sample the oats, bobbing and bowing his thanks, there seemed to be no limit to the appetite and industry of Mr. Tiddler. He flew backwards and forwards to the chimney pot and dropped in the grain. All day long he either carried corn or strutted round and round the top of the pot, cooing to the imprisoned Annabella. At night he roosted on the pot with his tail inside and cooed in his sleep. The church mice grew quite fat in that empty house, and so did Mrs. Tiddler, and so did her son who had hatched out of the egg. "I have called him Tobias, Mr. Tiddler," cooed Mrs. Tiddler down below. "You have called him nothing of the sort, Annabella. He shall be named Toby." "Your great-great-grandmother was a tumbler," replied Mr. Tiddler, strutting round and round, up above and shutting out half the sky. "How shall we ever get out? He will be ready to fly tomorrow," said Mrs. Tiddler. "Do you see 'ere a blue rock dove up there? He do pick up corn by the bushel and carries up by yonder." The sexton down in the road called up to the plumber and his boy at work on a leaking roof. "A cock blue rock? He's been strutting and bobbing these 2 hours on a chimney pot in Mermaid Street, curching into the chimney like as if he were looking for a sweep," added the plumber with aroused curiosity. "Hop across, Tom, and take a look." The apprentice scrabbled over 2 intervening roofs, clattering over the tiles. The starlings who nest in the gables flew out, scolding and screaming, and Mr. Tiddler paused in his dance. The sexton went round into Mermaid Street and watched from the opposite pavement while the boy climbed upon the chimney stack of the empty house. Mr. Tiddler stuck to his post in speechless indignation. He threw himself into an attitude of defiance, with one wing raised in the air. When the intruder stooped over the pot to look down, Mr. Tiddler rose upon his toes with a whinnying noise and slapped his wings across the boy's face, knocking off his cap, which fell into the chimney. "He's gone and done it," chuckled the sexton. "Climb in at the garret window, lad, the catch is broken." Tom scrambled cautiously down the roof. Mr. Tiddler remained on the chimney pot, uttering angry crows and puffing out his neck. Annabella and her son down below were hissing and slapping at the cap which had fallen on the top of them. The catch of the old-fashioned leaded window gave way with a push, and the boy stepped down into the garret through the cobwebs. "Here be corn for sure, but it be shelled," said Tom, looking round in perplexity at the piles of husks, relics of the supper parties of the friends of Madam Mouse. He pulled the sack out of the fireplace. It was followed by a stream of grain and mortar and dirt. On the top of it came his cap, and Mrs. Tiddler and her son, hissing and flapping and dazzled with the sudden return to daylight. Tom drove the young pigeon into a corner and caught it. Annabella bounced out of the window. The boy got out and climbed up the roof again, pursued by the 2 old pigeons, who flew wildly round his head. "He be a right fat un," said Tom, holding up his prize. "I likes pigeon pie," said the objectionable plumber, leaning over the chimneys of the next-door roof. "He be a beauty to keep in a dove-box," said Tom, stroking the even markings of the feathers. "I catched him," he added sullenly. Mr. Tiddler in desperation dashed at him from behind and knocked the cap over his eyes. The boy clutched at his cap, and Toby slipped through his fingers, fluttering down the tiles till he lay in the spouting overhanging the street. Mr. Tiddler alighted on the waterspout near him. He cooed and bobbed in wild defiance. Annabella looked on from the house on the opposite side of the street. She was feeling stiff. "I be afeard to follow him there. This roof be main rotten," said the boy. "Butterfingers," said the plumber. Mr. Tiddler taught his son to fly in the course of the afternoon, and Annabella exceedingly enjoyed a bath under the town pump. By the time she had preened and dried her feathers, Toby was down in the road, taking short flights, and running after his father, who was beside himself with ridiculous joy. He turned round and round in circles, cooing with his head wrong side up, his bill on the ground. They roosted at home in the Ypres tower that night, and ever after Mr. Tiddler bobbed and bowed devotedly upon the battlements, in proud admiration of his wife, Annabella.